This is yeah, fascinating how the extreme economic imbalances give rise to ideologies. I guess to explain the superiority of the where the power is concentrated. I think
And if I could say, Glenn,
yeah,
one thing that's interesting for me and very surprising, if you go to the writings of the greatest thinkers in Europe, uh, for example, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who is no doubt one of the great geniuses of Western civilization, he has scattered through his writings, it wasn't his main preoccupation, but a very race-based view of European superiority. And one reads that with some shock because he was the great universalist. He was the great describer of, indeed, the categorical imperative, which set universal standards for behavior. But the idea that Europe is inherently the superior civilization is deeply embedded, of course, in a wide range of ideologies stretching back from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, of course, to the period of Romantic nationalism in the 19th century, and on to Nazism and other ideologies of the 20th century that were based on superiority of race or religion or some other attribute of European culture that gave the right to dominate. And this is where so much goes wrong in our uh, thinking. Uh, these beliefs become deeply embedded, maybe not explicit, maybe they're even denied after a certain point, but they're embedded in the way that our governments, our states approach international issues.
I was at Immanuel Kant's 300-year birthday last year in Kaliningrad, and it did strike me some of the universalism behind it. There was some sense of superiority. But what was interesting with Samuel Huntington, he made this point that that the Western countries we tend to believe that we've been ruling the world for these centuries because of our superior ideas and values and ideology. But he made the point that it's really the mastered more efficient weaponry, controlled the sea lanes, and got a head start in the Industrial Revolution. And yeah, the rest of the world do not ignore this that it was our organized violence. but uh, but it begs the question: how will this lead to different rule by China? Because if the Eurocentric world was all these empires on a small continent. Um, how yeah, this kind of formed our way of looking at the world because our political theories tend to assume that you have this unavoidable geopolitical rivalry that is almost a law of nature. How do you think China would be different? Its geopolitical mentality would be different uh, than, for example, the way the Europeans have behaved because we always assumed it's all universal.
This is also an absolutely fascinating and much debated question, I would say, but I have my own views, which I'll share. And that is that the decisive event in Western political culture, if I may put it that way, is 476 AD, which is the collapse of the Western Roman Empire when Rome is conquered by Germanic conquerors. And at that point, it was a long process, but with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fragmented into multiple political entities. In fact, the complete complex, uh, remarkable kaleidoscope of political entities, of city-states and kingdoms and dukedoms and every conceivable form of political organization from the tiniest level up through would-be European-wide empires that never quite reached their billing, like the Holy Roman Empire that Charlemagne, in effect, began. But as it was famously said, it was never quite holy, never Roman, and never an empire in the way that it billed itself. But the point is, Europe was and is and remained, despite Napoleonic aspirations, despite Charlemagne's aspirations, despite what Hitler tried, never became a unified political entity. And today's European Union is is a different kind and still very weak construction of some kind of European-wide political organization. Europe fragmented and basically engaged in within European war for 1,500 years. And war became the standard. And thinking about statecraft is thinking about conflict in Europe. And so the idea that statecraft is anarchic, the famous assumption of realism in international relations theory, is a a good first projection of European reality, roughly from around 500 AD to at least, let's say, to 1950. And the idea that states therefore collide with each other, compete with each other, fight with each other, conquer each other, defeat each other, succumb, and so forth is European statecraft thinking. China is very, very different in its history. China unified in 221 BCE in the Qin dynasty, the first unification. And China's geographically kind of a box. The box has dryland steppe region, so-called, to the north, the Himalayas to the west, the tropical forests of Southeast Asia to the south, and the East China Sea, the Pacific Ocean to the east. It's a box that became a state, a unified administrative state more than 2,000 years ago. China fragmented at times. The Qin dynasty gave way to the Han era. The Han era broke apart, then became later reunited in the Tang and the Song and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing dynasties. But one could say that for most of the last 2,200 years, China's been a centralized administrative state. And the philosophy underpinning China is a Confucian philosophy that emphasizes the importance of harmony in keeping this integrated state functioning. Now, it's debated, does this lead to a different kind of statecraft of China? My answer is yes, it does actually. China does not think in terms of Western anarchic international statecraft. China thinks in terms of a large Chinese state where internal order is decisive and where external imperialism was never the rule for 2,000 years. China's vast and did not look for overseas territories by and large. Yes, one can point to particular places and episodes, but by and large, China had peaceful relations with its neighbors. I'll just give one example. From 1368, which is the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, to 1839, which is Britain's invasion of China in the First Opium War. So roughly for what is that, 500 years, uh, China did not engage in almost almost any fighting with its East Asian neighbors, with Japan, with Korea, and with Vietnam. With Vietnam, there was about a 17-year period of war in the 15th century. With Korea, as far as I know, China never invaded Korea even once, but China was the dominant power. And in Western statecraft, you'd say, well, China would invade and take over. Never tried. China never, during this period invaded Japan. Not even once. It was invaded by Japan once in 1592, I believe it is, or at least an attempt by a Japanese shogun, a military commander, to invade China. It failed, of course. But in any event, you had essentially a half a millennium of peace in East Asia. It's sometimes called the Confucian peace. Now, when I discussed this with our friend John Mearsheimer, a dear friend and a great political scientist, as far as I'm concerned, he says, no, 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 no. China will behave just the same way as any other great power. And he doesn't agree with this idea that China has a different kind of statecraft. I beg to differ. I love and admire John, but I disagree with him. I think China's view of statecraft is different, and it has been shaped by a different 2,000 years of history.
Professor Sachs, always fascinating to speak with you. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I think this will be a key focus in the years to come. To what extent China is its statecraft is distinctively different from that of the Western. So it is. I would like to see you and Mersheimer in a debate about this. So thank you again for your
We'll
time.
continue the discussion. Great to be
Great.
with you.